1 month had passed since the stellar fragment was destroyed, and the ripples of what humanity had done continued to spread across the galaxy like waves in a vast and endless ocean. Captain Choi Yuna brought her battered fleet home to Earth orbit, where crowds had gathered at every viewport and observation deck to watch the ship's return. And the cheers that greeted them could be heard even through the vacuum of space as broadcasts carried the celebration to every corner of the planet. But Yuna did not feel like celebrating. And when the official ceremonies were offered, she quietly declined them all. Instead, she held a private memorial in the gardens of Fleet Command headquarters, a small gathering of the families and friends of the 27 crew members who had not returned from the Merkin system. She spoke each name aloud and told stories about the people behind those names, not as heroes or symbols, but as real human beings who had chosen to give everything they had for strangers they would never meet. When she reached the names of Commander Im-Tae-1 and Ensign Park, So Young, and the other 7 crew members of the sacrifice ships, her voice finally broke, and she had to pause for a long moment before she could continue. "They asked me once why we were doing this," she said. "And I told them it was because we are human and because this is what humans do. And I stand by those words even now as I feel the weight of their absence." She looked at the families gathered before her, seeing their grief and their pride intermingled in expressions that she understood all too well. "Your loved ones died so that 800 million people could live," she told them. "And there is no way to make that fair or right or easy to accept. But I want you to know that their sacrifice meant something. And the galaxy will never forget what they did." On Thesser 4, the Vellani had erected a monument in the central plaza of their largest city, a towering structure of crystal and metal that caught the light of their sun and scattered it in patterns that seemed almost alive. The monument bore the names of every human who had participated in the relief mission, both the living and the dead, and at its base was inscribed a simple message in both Vellani script and Earth Standard: "They came when no one else would." Elder Dasani traveled to Earth personally to present Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin with the highest honor that the Vellani could bestow, an ancient recognition called the Breath of the Saved that had not been granted to an outsider in over 400 years. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall of the United Earth Government, and representatives from every nation watched as the Sani placed the medallion around Seo-jin's neck. "We called your people dangerous," the Sani said, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "and we were right. Because you are dangerous to despair, and dangerous to cruelty, and dangerous to the belief that nothing can be done when lives hang in the balance." She took Seo-jin's hands in her own and bowed her head. "The Vellani owe humanity a debt that can never be repaid, and we will spend the rest of our existence trying anyway." 2 weeks later, the Galactic Concord reconvened to address the matter of humanity's membership status, and the atmosphere in the Grand Assembly was unlike anything that had come before. Young delegates from a dozen species rose to speak in favor of granting Earth full membership immediately, citing the bravery and selflessness that the humans had demonstrated in the Merkin system. "They did what we could not," declared the representative from the Then oligarchy. "And more importantly, they did what we would not. And if that does not earn them a place among us, then our principles mean nothing." But the old guard was not ready to surrender their positions, and the Crystalline Accord delegate spoke in opposition with her chiming voice sharp with disapproval. "The humans acted recklessly and outside proper channels," she argued, "and they set a dangerous precedent by taking matters into their own hands without consulting the Concord." "Perhaps the precedent needed to be set," replied the Morthax delegate, surprising everyone who remembered that his species had been among the loudest voices calling for delay. The debate continued for hours, with neither side willing to give ground, until finally the presiding arbiter recognized Ambassador Seo-jin and granted her the floor. She stood slowly and walked to the speaking platform at the center of the assembly. And when she began to speak, her voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of the chamber. "You ask if we set a dangerous precedent," she began. "And I will answer that question honestly, because yes, we did. And the precedent is this." She looked around at the assembled delegates, meeting their eyes one by one. "When lives hang in the balance, humans act. And we do not wait for permission, and we do not calculate acceptable losses. And we do not debate while children ask if anyone is coming to save them." The chamber was silent as she continued. "You may keep your membership votes if that is what you decide. And you may continue to call us dangerous if that helps you sleep at night. But know this," her voice grew stronger with each word. "The next time the galaxy needs someone to run toward the fire instead of away from it, we will not wait for an invitation. Because that is who we are, and nothing you decide here today will change that." She returned to her seat without waiting for a response. And the vote was called shortly afterward. Humanity received full membership in the Galactic Concord by a margin of just 3 votes, with the Villani and several other species providing the deciding support. But Seojin knew that the vote itself did not matter, because something much larger had changed in the way the galaxy saw her people. In the final days of that month, a young Villani girl named Senna stood on the surface of Thesserfor and looked up at the night sky, searching for a particular star among the thousands that filled the darkness. Her mother came to stand beside her and followed her gaze upward. "What are you looking for, little one?" Senna pointed toward a small yellow dot that was barely visible among its brighter neighbors. "That one is Earth. And I learned how to find it in school today." Her mother smiled and put an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Why did you want to find it?" "Because I want to remember where the brave ones live," Senna said simply. "And because someday when I am grown up, I want to be like them. Someone who runs toward the fire when everyone else is running away." Her mother held her close and thought about everything that had happened. The fear and the despair, and then the impossible miracle of salvation that had come from the stars. "I think you will be," she said softly. And I think they would be proud to know that. They stood together in the quiet night, looking at the distant light of Earth. And somewhere across the vast emptiness of space, the people of that small blue world continued their lives, without knowing that they had become something more than they had ever been before. They had become a symbol of hope for everyone who had ever wondered if anyone would come to help them. And across the galaxy, for the first time in human history, when other species spoke of Earth, the word they used most often was no longer dangerous, it was necessary. The 3 sacrifice ships moved away from the main fleet and oriented themselves toward the stellar fragment that loomed against the stars like a wound in space itself. Their names were the Defiance, the Morning Star, and the Unbroken. And together they carried 9 crew members who had chosen to give their lives so that 800 million strangers might live. Captain Choi Yuna watched them go from the bridge of the Indomitable, and she felt the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders like nothing she had ever experienced before. "All remaining vessels, form up for support operations," she ordered, her voice steady even though her heart was breaking. "And our job is to clear a path through the debris field so our volunteers can reach the core." The fleet responded instantly, cargo haulers and mining ships and battlecruisers alike moving into formation with a precision that would have impressed any military commander in the galaxy. Lieutenant Commander Shin Yunbai commanded the Defiance, and she was the first to speak as the 3 ships began their approach. "Fleet Command. This is Defiance actual reporting, all systems nominal and crew ready for final approach." Her voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the fear that she must have felt. Captain Ru Min-jun of the Morning Star followed. "Morning Star confirms ready status, and it has been an honor serving with all of you." The youngest of the 3 commanders was Ensign Park So Young of the Unbroken, barely 23 years old, and already showing the kind of courage that veterans twice her age would. "Envy unbroken standing by," she reported simply, and then added in a softer voice, "Tell my parents I love them." Yuna had to look away from the view screen for a moment to compose herself before responding. "Your message will be delivered, Ensign, and your sacrifice will never be forgotten." The main fleet began its assault on the debris field that surrounded the stellar fragment. Using every weapon, they had to blast a corridor through the spinning rocks and ice and metal that would have torn the sacrifice ships apart. The cargo hauler New Horizon took a direct hit from a massive chunk of debris that spun out of the field faster than the targeting systems could track, and the impact tore through its engine compartment and sent the ship drifting helplessly toward the fragment. New Horizon. "Report status," Yuna demanded. The response came from the ship's captain, a civilian named Quan Ji-hoon, who had volunteered his vessel for the mission. "We have lost main propulsion and are caught in the gravitational pull of the fragment, and I am ordering my crew to the escape pods, but there was not enough time for an evacuation." And everyone on the bridge of the Indomitable knew it. Yuna made a decision in that moment that went against every tactical calculation. Turning to her helmsman with fire in her eyes, "Bring us alongside the New Horizon," she ordered, "because we are going to tow them to safety." Commander Tae-1 was aboard one of the sacrifice ships and could not counsel caution. But her tactical officer spoke up in his place. "Captain, that maneuver will expose us to the worst of the debris field and could compromise our own vessel." "I am aware of the risks," Yuna replied, "and I am also aware that I will not leave those people to die. If there is anything I can do to save them." The Indomitable surged forward into the chaos, her shields flaring with impacts as rocks and metal fragments slammed against her hull. And the crew worked with desperate efficiency to extend towing cables to the stricken cargo ship. For 7 terrible minutes, they fought the debris field, taking damage that would have crippled a lesser ship. But the Indomitable held together through skill and determination, and perhaps a little bit of luck. The New Horizon was pulled free just as the last escape pod launched, and Yuna allowed herself one moment of relief before turning her attention back to the main mission. The 3 sacrifice ships had reached the outer boundary of the fragment, and now came the hardest part, Defiance beginning final approach to target coordinates, Unbai reported. And on the tactical display, her ship disappeared into the mass of the fragment itself. "Morning star following," said Min-jun. And then a moment later, "We have entered the fragment, and the exotic matter is playing havoc with our sensors. But we are on course." So Young of the Unbroken was the last to enter, and her voice carried across the communication channel with a clarity that seemed to cut through all the static and interference. "Unbroken is committed, and I want everyone to know something before we do this." Yuna leaned forward. "We are listening, Ensign." "I used to wonder what made humans special," So Young said, "because the galaxy kept telling us we were primitive and dangerous and not worthy of a place among the stars. And I never had a good answer for that." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was filled with emotion. "But I know now. Because what makes us special is that we do not abandon people, and we do not calculate the value of lives, and we do not debate while children ask if anyone is coming to save them. This is what humans do," she finished, "and I am proud to be one." The 3 ships reached their designated positions within the heart of the fragment. Their reactor cores primed and ready for detonation. Yunbai spoke first. "For those who cannot run," Min-jun followed, "Earth remembers, and finally So Young, the youngest of them all. This is what humans do." The detonations triggered in perfect sequence. 3 brilliant flashes of light that tore through the exotic matter core and shattered the stellar fragment into 1,000,000 pieces. From the surface of Desert 4, it looked like a second sun had been born in the sky. a blazing flower of light that bloomed and then faded as the pieces of the fragment rained down through the atmosphere and burned away into harmless dust. The shockwave rocked the fleet, damaging several ships and injuring dozens of crew members. But when the light faded and the sensors cleared, the readings confirmed what they had hoped for. The fragment was gone, and HFY was saved. Silence fell across the fleet as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. And then slowly the communication channels filled with sounds that the human crews did not immediately recognize. It was coming from the surface of the moon below, broadcast on every frequency, a chorus of voices crying and laughing and calling out words in the Volani language that the translation systems rendered simply as "thank you," repeated over and over again. On Velithos Prime, the observation drones that the Galactic Concord had sent to monitor the situation transmitted their footage back to the Grand Assembly, and the delegates watched in stunned silence as 9 humans gave their lives to save a world that had rejected them. The Keth delegates stared at the images with an expression that might have been shame. "They sacrificed their own," he whispered, "for people who were not even their friends." No one in the chamber had an answer for that, because there was no answer that could encompass what they had just witnessed. Humanity had done the impossible, and the galaxy would never see them the same way again. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Merkin system, and what they saw made even the most optimistic among them fall silent with dread. The stellar fragment was larger than the initial reports had suggested, a massive irregular shape of rock and metal and something else that glowed with an inner light that the sensors could not properly identify. Captain Choi Yuna stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and studied the readings that her crew was gathering, and with each new piece of data, her expression grew more grave. "Chief Engineer Beak, I need your assessment," she said into the communication channel that connected her to the engineering vessel where Mina had set up her operations center. Mina's voice came back tired and strained. "The fragment contains a dense core of exotic matter that we did not anticipate, and our original deflection calculations are useless against something with this kind of mass concentration." Yuna closed her eyes for a moment and absorbed the weight of what she was hearing, understanding that everything they had planned might not be enough. "How long do we have?" she asked. 12 days until impact, and Captain, I do not see how our current equipment can fragment that thing into safe pieces." The bridge crew exchanged worried glances, and Yuna could feel the fear beginning to spread through her ship like a cold wind. She could not allow that fear to take hold. Not when so many people were counting on them. "All senior officers and department heads, report to the main conference room in 1 hour," she ordered. "Because we are going to find a solution, even if we have to invent one from nothing." The meeting that followed was tense and difficult, with engineers and tactical officers arguing about possibilities and limitations while the clock continued to count down. It was a young ensign named Han Seung-min who finally spoke up, his voice hesitant at first, but growing stronger as he explained his idea. "What if we do not try to deflect the fragment at all?" he asked, and the room turned to look at him with varying expressions of confusion and interest. "Go on," Yuna encouraged him. Seung-min stood and moved to the display screen, pulling up a diagram of the fragment and its exotic matter core. "The core is too dense for our deflection arrays, but it might be vulnerable to a different kind of force. Specifically, the contained energy release of a starship reactor going critical." Commander Tae-won leaned forward with sudden understanding. "You are talking about using our ships as bombs?" "Yes, sir," Seung-min confirmed, "and according to my calculations, if we position 3 reactor cores at optimal points within the fragment and trigger simultaneous detonations, the resulting energy release should shatter the entire structure into pieces small enough to burn up in the atmosphere of the HFY." The room was silent as everyone processed what the young ensign was proposing. The math was sound, but the cost was terrible. Those ships would need to fly into the fragment itself, Mina said slowly, and the crews would have no way to escape before detonation. Min nodded, his face pale but determined. I know what I am asking, and I know that I am asking people to die, but I do not see another way to save that moon. Yuna looked around the room at her officers, seeing the weight of the decision reflected in every face, and she knew that the choice was ultimately hers to make. We will not order anyone to die, she announced, but we will ask for volunteers, and we will make certain that everyone understands exactly what they are volunteering for. Within an hour, the call for volunteers had gone out across the entire fleet, and within another hour, Yuna had received 47 responses from crew members willing to sacrifice their lives for the mission. She read each name with a mixture of grief and pride, knowing that these people represented the very best of what humanity could be. From those 47, she would need to select only 9. 3 crews of 3 for each of the sacrifice ships. And the burden of that selection weighed on her like nothing she had ever experienced. Meanwhile, on Desert 4, the evacuation was underway. But the Villani did not have enough ships to save everyone, and Elder Thasani had been forced to begin the impossible task of deciding who would live and who would be left behind. Families were being torn apart as some members were selected for evacuation, while others were told there was no room. And the grief that filled the refugee camps was almost too heavy to bear. In the midst of this despair, a young Villani girl named Senna sat with her mother and watched the sky, hoping to see some sign that help was coming. Mother, is it true that the humans are sending ships to save us? She asked. Her mother stroked her daughter's head and tried to find words of comfort. That is what the broadcasts say, little one. But my teacher says humans are dangerous and that we should not trust them. The mother was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything she had heard about the strange species. From the distant yellow star, perhaps dangerous, is exactly what we need right now. She finally said. Senna considered this and then made a decision, moving to the communication terminal in their shelter and recording a message that she broadcast on open channels for anyone to hear. My name is Senna, and I am 7 years old, she said into the recorder, and I want to know if the humans are really coming to save us, because my teacher says you are dangerous, but my mother says dangerous is what we need. And I just want someone to tell me if we are going to be okay. The message traveled across space until it reached the human fleet, and it was played on the bridge of the Indomitable, where Captain Yuna listened with tears forming in her eyes. She thought about the volunteers who had offered their lives, and she thought about the little girl who was asking if anyone cared enough to help. All hands, she announced over the ship-wide channel, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. Prepare for Operation Shatterpoint, because we are going to show that child exactly what humans are made of. The volunteer crews began boarding their ships, walking toward a fate they had chosen freely. And as they went, they carried with them the weight of 800 million lives. Commander MT-1 was among those who had volunteered. And before he boarded his vessel, he recorded a final message for his family. Back on Earth, tell my daughter that her father went toward the fire instead of away from it, he said. And tell her that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is stand between danger and those who cannot protect themselves. He ended the recording and walked to his ship without looking back. The countdown continued, and the fleet prepared for the most desperate mission in human history. The dockyards of Lagos Station had never seen activity like this before, and workers moved through the massive orbital facility at all hours of the day and night as humanity scrambled to assemble a fleet from whatever pieces they could find. Chief Engineer Beak Mina had not slept in 36 hours, and she did not plan to sleep anytime soon, for there was too much work to be done and too little time to do it in. She stood on the observation deck, overlooking the main hangar where teams of engineers were converting mining lasers into deflection arrays, stripping the equipment from civilian vessels and mounting them onto anything that could carry the weight. The math is brutal, she told Admiral Park during their morning briefing, her voice rough from exhaustion and too much coffee. And we need to fragment that stellar mass into pieces small enough to burn up in the atmosphere of Desert before they can cause damage. Park studied the projection she had prepared and nodded slowly, understanding that what she was proposing would push their technology and their people to the absolute limit. Can it be done? He asked. Mina looked at him with tired eyes that still held a spark of determination. I would not be here if I did not believe it could be done, sir. And my teams will make it happen or die trying. Across the station, Captain Choi, Yuna was conducting crew assignments for the lead vessel of the relief fleet, the battlecruiser Indomitable, which had seen better days but remained one of the most capable ships in the human navy. Her first officer commander in Taiwan entered her quarters with a posted datapad containing the latest volunteer roster, and his expression carried a complexity that she had learned to read over their years of service together. We have more volunteers than we have positions, he reported, and many of them are civilians from cargo ships and mining operations who have never faced anything close to combat conditions. Yuna took the datapad and scrolled through the names, seeing ordinary people who had chosen to risk their lives for strangers on the other side of the galaxy. And she felt her throat tighten with emotion. Train them as best you can during the journey, she ordered, because they deserve every chance we can give them. Taewon hesitated before speaking again, and when he did his voice was lower and more personal than his usual professional tone. Captain, may I speak freely? You always can with me, old friend. He took a breath and looked out the viewport at the chaos of the dockyards beyond. The Volani are not our allies, and in fact they voted against our full membership just last year, calling us too aggressive and too unpredictable to be trusted with a seat at the table. Yuna set down the datapad and turned to face him fully, understanding his doubt because she had felt it herself in quiet moments. I know their history with us, she said, and I know that many of them believe we are dangerous primitives who should have been left on our own planet. Then why are we doing this? Taewon asked, and his question was genuine rather than challenging. Why are we risking everything for people who would not do the same for us? Yuna was quiet for a moment as she considered her answer, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. 800 million people. Taewon, and that is the only number that matters. She stepped closer to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. We are not doing this because the Volani deserve our help, or because they would help us in return. And we are not doing this because the galaxy will respect us for it, or because it serves some political purpose. Then why? Because we are human, she said simply. And this is what humans do when others are in danger. And if we lose that part of ourselves, then we have lost everything worth saving. Taewon held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded slowly, something settling in his expression as though her words had answered a question he had been carrying for a long time. I understand, Captain, and I will make sure the crew understands as well. 3 days later, the fleet was ready to depart. A mismatched collection of vessels that would have made any proper military commander weep with frustration. There were 3 battlecruisers, including the Indomitable, along with 2 older frigates that had been pulled from reserve storage, 7 cargo haulers that had been hastily armed, 4 mining vessels equipped with the converted deflection arrays, and a dozen smaller support craft that would handle logistics and communications. It was not an armada by any measure, but it was everything humanity could spare. And the crews aboard those ships had chosen to be there knowing full well the risks they faced. Admiral Park addressed the fleet via broadcast from Lagos Station, his image appearing on screens throughout every vessel. You are about to do something that has never been done before, he told them, And you are doing it not for glory or recognition, but because it is right. And because someone has to stand up when others will not." He paused and looked directly into the camera, as though he could see each of them individually. "The galaxy is watching, though they do not yet know what they are seeing. And by the time you reach the Merkin system, they will understand that humanity is not the primitive species they believed us to be. You carry with you the best of what we are. The courage and the compassion, and the stubborn refusal to accept that nothing can be done. So go now and show them what humans are made of." The fleet entered hyperspace one ship at a time, their drives flaring bright against the darkness, before they vanished into the void between stars on Velathos Prime Ambassador Yoon. Seo Jin returned to the Grand Assembly just as the fleet departed, and she took her seat in the lowest tier and waited patiently for the debates to continue. The Keth delegate noticed her return and called out across the chamber, "Ambassador Yoon, we have reports of unusual activity in Earth orbit. And perhaps you would care to explain what your people are doing?" Seo Jin smiled politely and stood to address the assembly with perfect diplomatic composure. "Earth has decided to handle this matter independently," she announced. "And we did not wish to burden the Concord with additional complications. So please continue your important discussions at whatever pace you find comfortable." The chamber erupted into confused murmurs and demands for clarification. But Seo Jin simply took her seat again and folded her hands in her lap. Let them talk, she thought. While her people flew toward the fire, the galaxy would learn soon enough that words meant nothing compared to action. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Concord stretched across 17 levels of the station world called Velathos Prime. And on this day, every seat was filled with delegates from 47 different species who had gathered to discuss a crisis that grew worse with every passing hour. Ambassador Yoon So-gin sat in the lowest tier of the assembly, where humanity had been placed 11 years ago when Earth received its provisional membership. And she watched the endless debate unfold above her with growing frustration burning in her chest. The crisis was simple to understand, but apparently impossible to solve through committee discussion. For a rogue stellar fragment, the size of a small moon was hurtling toward the inhabited world of Thesser 4 in the Merkin system, where 800 million Villani refugees had built their new home after fleeing their original planet decades ago. The Lani chose to settle in an unstable system, declared High Speaker Voranth of the Keth Dominion, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of dismissal. And we cannot be expected to risk our ships and our people to correct their poor judgment. Seonjin felt her hands tighten on the armrests of her chair as murmurs of agreement rippled through certain sections of the assembly, and she wondered how anyone could speak so casually about 800 million lives as though they were merely numbers on a calculation sheet. The crystal in the cord delegate rose next, her translucent form catching the light as she spoke in chiming tones that the translation systems rendered into flat speech. We would consider contributing resources to a relief effort, but only with proper compensation guarantees from the affected parties and their allies. More debate followed as the Morthax Collective insisted on a full geological survey before any action could be taken. And the Then oligarchy questioned whether the fragment was truly as dangerous as initial reports suggested. Zio Jin pressed a button on her console to request speaking privileges, and a small light appeared next to her name on the assembly registry. But the presiding arbiter glanced at it and moved on to recognize a delegate from the Sithani Federation instead. This was the third time her request had been ignored, and she understood the message clearly enough. For humanity held only provisional status and had no voting rights on emergency matters, which apparently meant their voice was considered unworthy of being heard at all. The countdown timer on her personal display showed that Thesser 4 had 19 days before the stellar fragment would strike, and the assembly had already spent 2 full days in debate without reaching any decision at all. She thought about the people on that distant moon, the families who were watching the sky and wondering if anyone would come to help them, the children who did not understand why a piece of the universe had decided to fall on their home. The Sathani delegate was speaking now about forming a subcommittee to assess the political implications of intervention. And Seojin felt something shift inside her, a quiet decision forming in her mind like ice crystallizing in still water. She stood from her seat and walked toward the exit of the chamber, and a few delegates turned to watch her go with expressions of mild curiosity or perhaps relief that the human representative was removing herself from their important discussions. The Keth delegate called out to her, "Does the human ambassador find our proceedings beneath her attention?" Seojin paused at the doorway and turned back to face the assembly. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "I find your proceedings very informative, High Speaker, and I thank you for the education." She left before anyone could respond. And once she was in the corridor outside, she pulled out her communication device and composed a message to Earth, using the emergency diplomatic cipher that only a handful of people could decode. The message was brief because it needed to be, and it reads simply, "They are still talking and show no signs of stopping, so I must ask, how fast can we move?" She sent the transmission and then stood by the viewport that looked out over the station world below, watching the lights of 1,000 different species going about their daily lives, while somewhere far away, a moonful of refugees waited to learn if they would live or die. Back on Earth, the message arrived at Fleet Command headquarters in the middle of what had been a quiet afternoon, and Admiral Park Junho read it 3 times before setting down his coffee and calling his senior staff into the situation room. "The Galactic Concord is handling this exactly as we expected," he told them as they gathered around the tactical display, "which means they are handling it by not handling it at all." Commander Beekmina, his chief of engineering operations, pulled up the latest projections on the stellar fragment, and the numbers were not encouraging. For the object was massive and moving fast, and conventional deflection methods would require more firepower than Earth currently possessed. "We have 18 days, Park said, looking at each of his officers in turn, "and I need to know what we can put together in that time." "Sir, our resources are limited," said Captain Choi Yuna, who commanded the battlecruiser Indomitable and was considered one of the finest tactical minds in the fleet. "But limited has never meant impossible for us." Park nodded and felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the pride he always experienced when he saw his people rise to meet a challenge that others would call hopeless. "Get me everything we have that can fly," he ordered. "And I mean everything, from our battlecruisers down to the cargo haulers and mining vessels, because we are going to need every ship and every hand we can find." The room erupted into activity as officers began making calls and pulling data and calculating logistics. And Park watched them work with the knowledge that what they were attempting had never been done before. They would fly across the galaxy to save people who had voted against their membership just last year. People who had called humans dangerous and primitive and unworthy of a seat at the galactic table. And they would do it not because they expected gratitude or reward, but because 800 million people were going to die if someone did not act. And humanity had never been very good at standing by while others suffered. Park turned to the viewport and looked up at the stars that humans had only recently begun to explore. And he thought about what it meant to be part of a galaxy that would debate the value of lives while time ran out. 18 days, he said quietly to himself. And then he went to work. Far away on Velathos Prime, the Grand Assembly continued its debate long into the night. And no one noticed that the human ambassador did not return to her seat, for they had far more important matters to discuss than the comings and goings of a provisional species. They did not know that across the void, a different kind of discussion was taking place. One measured not in words, but in actions, and that humanity had already made its decision. The galaxy could keep talking for as long as it wished. Earth was done waiting.